Welcome to Round the Table. I'm Ben John of Christian Concern and the Wilberforce Academy, and it's great to be back with another episode where we're going to be talking about a variety of different issues, including some of what's been going on in Scotland regarding the church closures, which we at the Christian Legal Centre have been heavily involved in challenging, and also the threats that are coming through the amendments to the Scottish hate crime bill. So firstly, we're going to be talking about the church closures and the issues surrounding that. Please do post in the comments where you're from, say hello, and also do make sure to put your comments in and to ask any questions. We really want to be engaging with you and hearing what you have to say about these critical issues that we are engaging with. So on the question of the church lockdown, we've launched a legal challenge, judicial review against the Scottish Government regarding the church closures in Scotland. And here you can see a video from some of the church leaders about why they are challenging the government.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey.
My name is James McInnes.
I'm William MacLeod.
The Reverend Nathan Owen.
And I want to explain my involvement in challenging the Scottish Government about shutting down a church and criminalising public worship.
We cannot afford to close churches during what is the most certainly one of the greatest challenges that's facing our world.
Because the church offers life to the dead. It offers hope to the hopeless. It offers light to those living in darkness.
In a time of famine, you don't go and burn a country's crops. In a storm, you don't shut down the lighthouses, take a cricket bat to the lamp. And when the nation faces a life and death crisis, you don't close down the one source of true hope that Scotland has turned to for centuries.
Never has it been more urgent for the gospel of Jesus Christ to be heard in our beloved land. Never has it been more fitting for the civil government, far from closing the churches, to fulfill their duty under God and encourage people to hear what God is saying to us.
People are struggling, people are dying in our communities. They need access to the church.
Now, we do recognise that the situation of COVID is something very serious, and churches throughout this past year have sought to follow a number of guidelines which have been given by the government in order to protect public health and safety.
Churches have demonstrated that they are one of the most COVID secure parts of our society.
We have sought to put in place the social distancing, the hand washing. We have compromised in many ways, but this ban has completely destroyed the legality of being allowed to meet together as God has commanded us.
I serve a number of people, some of whom really are very vulnerable, and I've seen firsthand the really quite dire consequences of what shutting churches has done in the lives of a number of people.
Maybe you're not living in an area where I live in, but I live on a council estate. I live on a scheme within Scotland, within Edinburgh. And there is a lot of darkness here. There is a lot of hopelessness. People struggling with drug and alcohol addiction.
Several people in my own neighbourhood who have taken their own lives because they have no hope.
Single mothers struggling. People with mental health finding that their mental health is even worse now than it was before.
It has brought also a great deal of isolation. These restrictions are supposed to be about protecting the vulnerable, and yet it is causing the vulnerable in our fellowship to suffer great anxiety over isolation.
Presently, if you were to pass away, I can conduct your funeral service, but the current legislation may hinder me from offering pastoral support and spiritual encouragement as you're dying.
God says, preach the gospel. The government says, close the churches. But people are dying. Many people are afraid. We have the glad tidings of great joy.
So we think the churches being open is not just a human right or a Scottish constitutional matter, but it's actually one of the most vitally important ways our society can respond during this pandemic.
The church has to open up. The church is essential. The church needs to do what it's called to do by God.
Remember, the soul is more important than the body. Eternity is more important than time. So we feel very strongly that in a time like this, the churches should be open.
Powerful and inspiring video there. So delighted to have with us my colleagues Tim Dieppe and Carys Moseley from Christian Concern, and a special guest, William Phillip, Senior Minister at the Tron Church in Glasgow, who is one of the church leaders who's put their names forward to stand against this church closure. It's great to have you all on with us.
Thank you.
William, I'll come to you first. Why have you put your name forward onto this legal challenge?
Well, I've done so not without a lot of thought and consideration. Certainly not something I've ever done before or expected to be doing, but really because I think this issue is so important. And I think that one of the saddest things about this whole period of pandemic has been really a lack of leadership of the nation by the church. It's something that early on in the pandemic was being noted even by secular commentators, atheist commentators, saying, where is the spiritual leadership at a time of crisis? And, eventually many of us got together and said, well, look, we as church leaders need to show church people at least that there is some leadership, and to show the nation that there is. That's why I was involved initially with writing various letters to the Prime Minister and First Ministers, along with many hundreds, thousands, in fact, of others, seeking to make these points. And in particular, back in November, when there was a real threat churches might close again, and in England and Wales they did, I was involved with that. At that time in Scotland, we were still able to meet, although with very small numbers. But when it came to this further lockdown after Christmas, we wrote again to the Scottish government, got rebuffed again, and we felt really in the end the only way of engaging seems to be to take the legal route. It's the only thing that's been left open to us, and it is a legitimate engagement in our democratic society. It's part of being engaged. We're enabled to vote, but we also have access to the judiciary. And fundamentally, really, the reason that I'm willing to go to law is because I do think the government has overstepped itself. I do think it's overreached in this, and perhaps in some of the other things that have been done. And I think they're wrong. I think they've made a mistake. And I think in other jurisdictions where these challenges have been made legally, it's been shown that governments have overreached. And I think it's very, very important that governments are also held account and have to act according to the rule of law. If we don't hold them to that, then it's a very dangerous precedent that's being set. So there are many other reasons, but I guess the fundamental thing does come down to that. It's an overreach of the government into the life of the church and the government of the church, which is a fundamental problem. And I think that's really what it is.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that many Christians and very well-meaning and wanting to serve the Lord perhaps have sometimes failed to understand about the questions of authority and what areas the government has authority to intrude on the government of the church. And I think when we sort of misunderstand those spheres of authority, then these kinds of things that we're seeing now can quite easily happen. So this is an argument, yes, we've seen this in England and in Wales that we've been making quite a bit. Tim, could you maybe just update us at the moment on where we're at on the judicial review in Scotland and what we're doing and how that's working out at the moment?
Yeah. So, well, I was just thinking you're talking about the separation of church and state there, aren't you, really, Ben? And William and Dee as well, really, about how the state has influence and authority in certain areas, and then the church should have its own authority in certain areas as well. And that's really a key principle that sort of goes back a long way in this. But in terms of the legal case, of course, it sort of started back in June with the very first lockdown, when a group of English churches wanted to challenge the fact that churches were closed even back then. And that went to letter before action and so on. And then just before it was about to go into court, into legal action, the government backed down and said, okay, we're going to open up churches. And come November, the government came back again, and first of all it was Wales, and then it was England and Wales in November, and of course there was much more support for challenging the government at that time. We had 122 or something leaders from England and Wales challenging that lockdown, and then of course Theresa May and others also weighed in about the immorality of this closure of churches, and then we're very pleased now that churches in Wales are allowed to meet in this lockdown. But of course, then Scotland came in January, and churches have been banned from meeting since the beginning of January, I think it is. And so a pre-action letter was sent, signed by 20-something, or was it 30, I think, 30 church leaders in Scotland. And then the government responded, an extraordinary response, really, because it actually said we have authority over the secular activities of the church. When you can read that letter online, maybe one of my colleagues can put it up in a link there. They actually described it as the secular activities of the church, showing incredible misunderstanding about the nature of church to describe it in that way. So we've had to go to the next stage, which is formally petition for judicial review, and I think we're waiting for a response from that. But we're hoping that can go into court and be heard, and that permission will be obtained for this, because we do believe that there's a very strong legal case here on this one.
Thanks, Tim. Carys, something we touched on just a bit earlier was about sometimes the lack of leadership we're seeing from some of the denominations, and I think the Church of Scotland has said that they've explicitly opposed the legal challenge and want the churches shut. Carys, why do you think there is this sort of institutional lack of leadership across some of the mainline denominations?
I used to work for one of the theological colleges at Church of Scotland, so I have an idea of what it's like. There's probably a lack of unity inside, we know, because there are people who want to open in the Church of Scotland. It is the national established Church of Scotland. It's very close to the government, the way it acts and behaves, and has been for a long time. And when that situation happens, there's this creeping scenario where people think that everything the government does is right, and they're just a little bit too close. And there's been people who've studied the effect of lobbying and where you are, whether you're inside on the threshold or outside speaking critically and prophetically to society. So it's about distance or proximity to not just the government of the day, but the government as such. That's what I would say. It doesn't matter if it's Church of Scotland, Church of England, or whoever, or as in Wales, we don't have an established church, but the closer you are, the more tempted you are, and the more blind you can be to the need for discernment about what you said about which authority, is it God or Caesar, that we're going to listen to most.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see here a comment from A Mission for AJ. If the government tries to restrict the church and the mission of the Great Commission, then we should disobey government. The bigger picture with salvation of souls is more important. Of course, we're not saying now advocating civil disobedience, but it raises important questions for us as Christians as to who is Lord, Christ or Caesar, and what that looks like. And we really do need wisdom. And this has been a time, I think, where the church has been forced to wrestle with questions which they haven't done before. William, maybe could you just share some of what it's like on the ground in Glasgow pastorally? Has this been difficult for your congregation, not being able to meet for worship, having restrictions, and how you sort of shepherd your congregation? Perhaps you could just share some of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have a very diverse congregation, around 500 or so, including a sizable congregation of Farsi-speaking, mostly Iranians who have come to this country as refugees. We have a work among drug addicts. So we have a students, family. We've got a wide range. I would say that everybody's been affected, and the longer it's gone on, the worse it's been. I would say I've seen an enormous amount of damage to mental health, to physical health, all of the things that are being experienced by everybody. But also just a real discouragement and difficulty. I mean, we're probably in a more fortunate situation than many. We've been able to adapt with quite good technology. We've been able to broadcast services, have Zoom call, do a lot of things right from the beginning. But even with that, I suppose I would just say that there's a general depression over everybody. And I've seen, I would say, by and large, among the elderly folk in the congregation, I would say most of them that I've had contact with, I think have declined in general health and well-being. We have a lot of young students who have been really isolated. So there's multiple pathology all over the place, including people. We've had somebody die as a result of slipping back into drug use, which they've been clean from for many years. That's a particular tragedy. I've seen people who have had major health problems because they've not been able to get, or they've not sought the medical help that they needed. So as a sort of little microcosm of society in the city, the protracted lockdowns have brought great problems in multiple ways. And for many of these folk, being able to at least meet together in church on Sundays, however curtailed that is in terms of numbers and wearing masks and all the rest of it, has literally been a lifeline. And when it was stopped again just after Christmas, there was just among most people, there was just a real feeling of almost despair in a way. And I mean, that's just the truth of it. It's been very, very hard.
Yeah. William, can I ask you, because Scotland's got a rich history, hasn't it, of Christianity and the influence of the Bible, and even sending missionaries and all of this kind of stuff, as well as sometimes objecting to government trying to shut down these things. Are there aspects of that have inspired you in this current work?
Yes, well, interesting. I just not long ago read through Donald MacLeod's latest book on Scottish theology from the 1500 to 1700. The title is "Therefore the Truth I Speak," and that tells a lot of the story of the Reformation and the immediate post-Reformation church, because it was all bound up with these questions of the church and the powers that be. And the Reformed church in Scotland, in seeking to be biblical and submit to Scripture and so on, found that all the way through that very often put them into conflict with the kings, particularly the Stuart kings, and governments and so on. And so that there have been lots of points of conflict. You go right back to John Knox, Andrew Melville, these others. There are famous stories of how they preached to the kings and queens of the day, to Mary Queen of Scots, to James the Sixth and First, and so on. And we're very, very clear that yes, Christians are to render to Caesar, render to the kings and the governments what is theirs, but to God alone what is his. And so one of the comments that Donald MacLeod makes in his book somewhere is, he says, many governments of all kinds have hidden behind Romans 13, and including, for example, the apartheid governments in South Africa, which justified their horrendous policies by being, well, we are the government ordained of God. And he shows that right through Scottish history, there's a rich tradition of opposing that divine right of kings to rule untrammeled, and so on. And so it is an important aspect of Scottish history and church history, which in fact has been enshrined in Scottish law. This two kingdoms doctrine, that there are two kings and two kingdoms in Scotland, and of the one which is Christ's kingdom, the kings and the governments are just subjects like everybody else, and they're under the law. And that's been enshrined in Scottish law going back to the 16th century. It tried to be overturned by the Stuart kings throughout the 17th century. That was what led to decades, nearly a century of great conflict in Scotland until William and Mary came to the throne. There was a settlement and so on. But these things were so precious. They were enshrined in Scottish law. They were enshrined in the Act of Union. They were enshrined again in the 1921 Church of Scotland Act. So that is the coming into the civil law code, an understanding of church and its sole rule by Christ the King, which has come from strong Christian theology. So Scotland in particular actually gave that to the world in many ways. That theology has filtered into law in the United Kingdom, into the United States, and many other places. And so I think it's important to realize that to be faithful to Scripture and to be seeking to honor government as God has ordained it, which all of these great men did not mean never questioning the rule, never standing up against it, and indeed never resisting it at times when it encroached into places that it did not belong. And so really in that sense, I think we're standing in a long tradition in Scotland itself, which has very clearly stood up for that.
Many, I think, confuse that Romans 13 passage without sort of going on and reading that God's instituted the government as a servant, as a deacon of Christ. And, so yes, we are called to submit to the government, but the government is called to submit to God.
John Knox used a very helpful analogy in that. He's saying that, well, Scripture tells children they must obey a father, and that's a command of God. But if that father starts to abuse his children, neglect his children, and damage his children, there is no Christian who would say, well, keep on obeying the father like that. The father has stepped over his realm of authority and has transgressed and has put himself outside the proper authority of God, and therefore he must be challenged and must be removed. And that's applied in exactly the same way to government. Government in Romans 13 has to be obeyed by us as citizens. But first of all, government is under God, and government acts for him to promote what is good and to punish what is evil. And if, like a father, the government goes AWOL and starts to not do those things, then it is in breach of its first responsibilities. So we are to be responsible to government because they are first of all responsible to God and then responsible for the good of their people. And we mustn't forget those two things, which is the whole context of the commands that come to Christians in Romans 13. And that's something that's been emphasized right through from John Calvin, John Knox, Andrew Melville, Samuel Rutherford in particular, in his great book, The Law, Lex Rex, The Law and the Prince, and The Law and the King. And, ultimately he was saying it's the law that is king. The king is under the law. And we recognize that. That's why presidents can be impeached. That's why, governments can be challenged in the courts. It's why they must be challenged, because they're still under the law. They're still citizens. They're not in a godlike category. They're all under the sovereignty of God. And I think that's where we have to be very clear about this. And that's what gives Christians not just the right, but the responsibility to God to play their part in making sure that governance is as it should be. So I think it's really important that Christians see that we're not being enemies of good government by challenging it. We're being servants of good government. We're trying to stop government erring, and we want to be friends of government to help them not to err and to stay on the right track. And that really is what I believe we're doing in this legal case.
That's right.
Thank you. Just go to a final question before we move on. Nigel Ellerton writes, is it responsible to expose church members to a high risk level, even assuming the control measures have been introduced to reduce the risk factor? Is it one thing protecting church freedom and another we have responsibility for protecting the individual? William, how would you sort of respond to that?
I would say, no, it's not responsible to expose people to a high level of risk. But I think that the mitigation measures that have been in place are perfectly adequate to make that risk extremely small. And I think we've proven that over many months. Churches have been meeting, not just in our country, but actually all over the world for a long time. And there really is there's no attempt, even by the government or by government scientists, to say that church has been in any way a significant source of spread, or even any source of spread at all. So no, we don't want to expose people to high risk. I don't think any responsible church leader would do that. None of us are saying there are absolutely no circumstances in which we would ever suspend public worship for a time if the risk was very high. But right back in March, perhaps the risk was very high, and I don't think very many of us were quibbling with doing that for a few weeks then. But I think very, very quickly it became clear that the risks were much less than we thought, and certainly the risks in church, the way we're conducting church at the moment, is extremely small, and I would say far, far less risky than going to any supermarket. And so then it just comes down to a question of, well, as Christians, of course we would say supermarkets are important because our daily bread is important for our life. But the Bible tells us that there is a more important daily bread, doesn't it? And it really comes down to, is my bodily health more important than my eternal health? Or is it the other way around? And I think we have to say emphatically, it is the other way around. If we were given the choice of one visit a week, would it be to church or would it be to the food shop? I mean, that's quite an important question, I think, for Christians to ask, isn't it?
And I want to add as well, William, that let's remember that people have taken great risks for church, right? To meet, right? Taken huge risks to meet or to be baptized or to even to take communion or whatever. And you know, how many risk assessments did the Apostle Paul go through, you know, in all of his various exploits and so on? You know, surely the message from Christianity is that if there is a risk, and undoubtedly there is, surely it's worth it, right? Isn't Jesus worth it? Isn't worship worth it? Isn't gathering as Jesus commanded us to do worth it and worth a risk, right? And there are risks in everything that we do. And, you know, I wrote an article as well about lessons from church history and plagues. You know, the Puritans went into where the plagues were, you know, to minister. They opened up the churches that had been closed. You know, they went to the boarded up houses of the quarantined people that everyone else was running away from, to minister, to, you know, pray for them, to give them food and water and minister to them. And I think that, you know, somehow we've become scared, even as Christians, let alone as a nation, and we're too scared to actually do anything for God. Whereas, you know, our forebears would have taken great risks and sometimes lost their lives for serving, ministering the gospel and so on.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I just think I think what worries some people is not that they might be taking a risk themselves, but that they might be you know, exposing somebody else in an irresponsible way that they don't need to, and so they don't want to do that. And I think that's a right instinct. But I think we need to be prepared to take a lot more risk ourselves, absolutely, for the sake of the gospel. And it's been many, many times in church history when through plagues the church has grown because Christians have been the only ones willing to take that risk. That's what C.S. Lewis, when he said that it's those who have loved heaven most who have served earth best. And I think there is a problem, a big problem in modern Christianity today, and that is that the present, the earthly, the temporal has eclipsed the eternal. And I think that is the biggest problem throughout this pandemic, in the lack of church leadership in our country, that the eternal issues have been entirely eclipsed by the earthly. And if all that church leaders can say is take care, wash your hands, wear a mask, then who else is going to point people to the issues of eternity? And that, to me, that's the greatest danger. There are great losses in terms of people's mental well-being, the physical well-being, all of these things. There's untold damages there, undoubtedly. But the biggest damage of all is that the eternal hope of the Christian gospel is being largely pushed out in local communities, and the greatest need that people have at this time is being denied to them. And there can't be any greater danger than that if we believe that our gospel is an eternal hope. And Paul says, you know, if it's only for this life that we have faith, well, we're miserable failures. And that's I think, the damage that has been done to the cause of the gospel in our nation, because churches have not said this is the biggest issue above everything else. And I think that's what we want to reinstate.
Hugely inspiring and encouraging, William. Thank you for that. And so moving on now, there are some other challenges facing the church and Christians in Scotland with these hate crime bill, which is now looking possibly to attempt to ban conversion therapy. Carys, can you unpack for us what's happening and why this is a threat to Christian freedoms?
Well, can I just say that it's actually very topical that we've been talking about locking down churches, because churches, as we know, have been made to go online, and some can and some can't. And so the issue of what you can say and print online has become very important. I don't think enough people understand that you're being squeezed in this direction. So there's the Hate Crime and Public Order Bill Scotland, which is commonly known as the Scottish Hate Crime Bill, has attracted a lot of attention, not just in Scotland, in the UK, in different countries like the USA as well. So it's an attempt to update hate crime law and law on hate speech. So this week and last week there was a bit of a spat on Twitter, and that, not always that they're edifying, but sometimes you find out things that you really need to know about amendments that some of the LGBT movement wanted or didn't want, and from the government, and there was a fight because the LGBT movement doesn't want there to be what they call conversion therapy for gender confusion or transgenderism. And they want to use the law on hate speech to clamp down on the possibility that people can have mental health care and really church, Christian pastoral care for these problems, for people who are deeply unhappy with living as members of their sex. So there was a spat on that. But what I've been looking more on is also, nobody's really discussed this, but there was an amendment by John Finney, who's a Green Party MSP, to the bill. It was laid down just the end of last month, but really surfaced in the bill committee. And he wants to change the wording on freedom of expression on sexuality and sexual orientation, which is section 12 of the bill. For the details, you can look at an article I've just written, which has just gone up on the Christian Concern website. But basically, he was backed up with Patrick Harvey, co-leader of the Green Party in Scotland. They want to remove wording which at the moment creates an exemption. So you're free to, without prosecution, without threat of prosecution, to discuss or criticize sexual conduct or practices. And you're also free to use words that urge people to refrain from or modify sexual conduct or practices. That's the basic wording of the existing law. And what they want is to change that, to remove those exemptions, and instead they want to protect what sounds completely harmless, which is discussion or criticism of matters relating to sexual orientation, and that means towards either the same sex or the opposite sex. And you think, well, that sounds, what's the problem with that? Well, what it actually does is shift back freedom of speech from being able to talk about behavior to not being able to talk about it. And not being able to do any pastoral care, any recommendation. So if you're anybody, if you're a doctor of mental health, if you're a pastor of any kind, you would no longer be free to say, well, this kind of conduct isn't good for you. It's not aligned with how you've been created. It would be very difficult, even if somebody came to you asking for help in this area. And you can imagine, given the track record, of what's been happening over the last 10 years with equality legislation as well, the cases we've had with street preachers and so on, and with counsellors we supported in churches, it's going to become a big issue.
So, Carys, it sounds like it's more than conversion therapy. It sounds like it's an attack on Christian sexual ethics. You can't tell someone to abstain from sex expression outside marriage. That would be potentially a hate crime.
So, but when you look, and again, I've written about this, so you can see the detail, but the John Finney MSP actually did say in the committee, because the committee produced a short report on the initial meeting it had about the different amendments. He does say that what he's saying, he said, I refer to the removal of language relating to conversion therapy in the existing law. In other words, he thinks that the existing law allows people to help others to deal with same-sex attraction and behavior when it's not wanted by themselves and when they want pastoral care. So he wants to take that freedom away. And the fact that this being sneaked in has not been in the press is deeply concerning and should really concern all Scottish church leaders and lay leaders, pastoral carers across Scotland.
Because there's no exemption for what we might preach in a church, or what you might say in your home, or anything like that? Is there? I mean, you know what you might counsel someone to do. It's quite draconian, is it not? I mean, you know, there's been concerns in the past about even the Bible could be criminalised in this.
Yes, the Bible could be. I mean, people have already spoken with the Scottish Hate Crime Bill about possibility of criminalising the Bible. But interestingly, what I think it could also do is to, the amendment wasn't accepted the first time, but there are going to be new amendments. I mean, the committee's meeting next Tuesday. There's going to be more stages, so we're going to see more of this campaigning and this sneakiness, I think. But it could criminalise Scottish politicians who want to say things like, be critical of things like same-sex marriage or behavioural parenting in relation to public policy. And when you think that there are still sitting MSPs who voted in, I think it was 2014, against same-sex marriage in Scotland, that is quite shocking.
I think there have been quite a few wins, haven't there, already, in terms of the pressure and campaigning. So they have made some amendments, and there's some quite helpful things there. But the one of the ones that's most concerning to me still is that this business of criminalising discussion that takes place just within the home and heard by nobody else. I think that's a very chilling thing. And, not even being able to discuss these things around the family dinner table with your children who come home from school and say, Mummy, Daddy, I was taught all this stuff in school today. What do you think about this? And then go back to school the next day and tell their teacher what their parents have said. That's a very, very chilling thing. And it sounds as though the government is resisting very much any sort of pressure to change that. And I think that's a particular area perhaps that people should be lobbying on.
Well, I was speaking to one father who said his son in the school, and this was in Scotland, they said, stand on this side of the room if you're pro-LGBT, and stand on this side of the room if you're not. And the son was had been well discipled. But awful kind of things going on. What's the culture like there, William? You know, I think, was it 2 years ago when there was that, the police had put up those posters saying things like, if you're homophobic or transphobic, you're not welcome here in this country. You know, what's the culture like? What's the sentiment like there?
Yes, I remember stepping off the underground and being met with that poster right in my face, and finding it, very offensive and hostile. There's a very strong lobby. At the moment, it's all been in the news, hasn't it? The whole sacking of Joanne Cherry. There's a lot of turmoil, I think, going on in the Scottish National Party, but there's a very powerful woke agenda there, and the fact that they rely on the votes of the Green Party is exacerbating that, because that's where a lot of this very radical stuff comes from, and it's very difficult. I mean, there is a lot of. It's very difficult for people to stand against that, because people are fearful, and they're very afraid if they are in public sector jobs. They're afraid for their jobs. They're afraid to speak out. Teachers are constantly being bombarded by this kind of thing. People working in the NHS are being bombarded with this kind of thing. They suddenly just get handed rainbow lanyards and all this kind of sort of thing, and it's very, very difficult to resist that. And I hear a lot of that from all sorts of people in these kind of disciplines. And the Scottish government here, it's very hard for people to oppose, because there's just a lot of attacks that come your way if that's what happens, I'm afraid to say.
Isn't there an issue also with platforms? So if you work in the public sector, you don't really have free speech on these issues. Whereas if you are not working in the public sector, you may have more. We've seen this a lot with gender issue in England and Wales. So what can churches do to facilitate, a witness, because they're not public sector bodies?
Well, I think we certainly encourage people to engage. I've engaged a lot with our MSPs over these issues, and particularly all through lockdown with a lot of them, and actually have had a lot of useful and helpful responses. I think there's many Christians feel, well, you won't get noticed. There's not much point in that? What's the bother? But actually, they do note and they do engage. And I've listened to questions that have been put in the Scottish Parliament, which have been put by either myself or others that I've known. And so I would just encourage people to do that. And I think churches need to be unafraid to speak out. And we need to be doing that. We need to be seen to be doing that in the public eye. But it does attract a lot of opprobrium, and it's not very pleasant, and it's hard to do. It requires courage, and I think we need to be courageous, because there's a naivety in saying, well, God is sovereign, let's just get on with preaching the gospel. I'm absolutely certain that getting on with preaching the gospel is the primary role, especially of church leaders. We are not, I'm not an MSP, I'm not an MP. That's not going to be my role. I'm not going to spend my whole time doing that. But I do have to educate and teach Christians that we all are Christian citizens. I'm a citizen like everybody else. And, we're foolish and naive if we think that by Christians just hunkering down and hoping that these things won't happen, things are going to get better. I mean, you just need to read a little history to realize that's not how things work. And in order to be able to do gospel ministry, we've got to be able to speak gospel words. And in order to be able to do that, we've got to fight for the right of freedom of speech. We've taken these things for granted for so long that perhaps we forget that these things didn't just happen. Actually, they were fought for, and often fought for in a very literal sense. And we give them up at our peril. So, yeah, I think Christians need to be courageous, and there will be times that people are faced with what's more important, standing for the truth on this or getting my promotion at work. And that's a very hard thing, isn't it? I mean, it's
sometimes losing your jobs, and indeed, as some of our cases have. Before, I think I saw Felix de Gaulle was watching this, and there's an example. Fortunately, that we ended up winning that one in court, but of course, setting a powerful precedent, we hope, on that one as well. But
fighting these cases in the public eye is vitally important, because they're not just those cases that are being fought. It's many, many thousands of others that are being protected by it. So it is vitally important. I mean, it's just not we can't step out of earthly life. We can't step out of the realities of society going around about us. And there are certain things. We call it the left-handed work and the right-handed work. Martin Luther used that phrase, but we've sort of adapted it. The right-handed work is the chief work of the gospel that churches are to be about all of the time. It's where we want to give our time and attention. We want to be evangelizing, preaching, teaching, spreading the kingdom of God. But in order for those things to be able to happen, there is a certain amount of left-handed work that also has to be done. You can't just not ignore it. There are battles that have to be fought. There are things that have to be supported. There's time that has to be given to things which will allow the freedom for the gospel. And frankly, to think any different is naive. And it's only because people have done that in the past that we've got the ability to proclaim the gospel today.
Thank you so much for that, William. And I think the thing is that it's a similar theme to what we were seeing earlier, in the sense that this is just a state overreach into areas in which they do not have an authority to regulate what pastors are allowed to do, what pastors are allowed to preach or counsel their congregants in, or interfering into the role of the family and the authority of parents by saying, actually, you as parents can't teach your children in your values. We're going to impose our own values on your children. It's really
that was the issue with the named person scheme. And that was opposed vociferously, not just by Christians, but increasingly by many others who saw the dangers of that. And the Scottish government were defeated in the Supreme Court. If Christians, principally, as well as others, but particularly Christians, had not taken that stand and pushed that and devoted themselves to that, families in Scotland would have an incredible incursion today into their lives. So that was just the government got it wrong. And they had to be shown that they got it wrong. And in the event, they had to admit that they got it wrong. That's good for the nation. And the incursion into the family was the issue there. The incursion into the church is the issue here. They've got it wrong again. And in order to help them get it right, we need to take this action.
Very good. Yeah.
We be wise and gracious but courageous, as you say, and understand what these issues are doing, and understanding the threats that what it is the government are actually doing. And that kind of requires a prophetic voice as well, in a sense, to the culture. And
I think as well, it's worth saying that we're seeing a great in the whole coronavirus lockdown issue. We're seeing a very nasty polarization, which is characterizing anybody who speaks a word different to the prevailing narrative as evil, as wicked, as killers, all of this kind of thing. So we've got very eminent and very accomplished and intelligent people being sort of smashed in terms of their personally in the media and the social media and so on, and the whole debate has been turned into one of good versus evil. I think in this, it's very important that Christians don't get drawn into that, and it's not just that we're saying in every respect the government is evil or politicians are evil and all the rest of it. We're saying, look, we need to be able to have grown-up adult discussion about this and debate. Disagreement is healthy because it helps bring people to see what is right at the end of the day. And so to oppose the government in this is not saying the government is evil and we're right, and they're saying they're right and we're evil. We've got to be able to say, no, look, God's common grace is a great blessing to the world. We believe that God has ordained government, so we don't have the tyranny of anarchy, which would be far worse. But we also recognize that along with all that is good in that is fallen, sinful human nature, just as we're very aware of our own, but we also recognize it in others. And so we're wanting to say, let's have a constructive adult debate about these things. Where we're able to say, look, we think you've got it wrong. We want to help you put it right. It doesn't mean we're your enemies, at least not in everything. We may be very opposed to certain things, but we want to show that helpful, constructive, critical engagement. And I think the way that we do that is important. And I think we can set the tone for something very different in the public debate from what, sadly, is all around us just now. And that's another way, I think, where the church can show a better way. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
That's great.
No, absolutely. I think we can't be sucked into the strategies of the world and the tone of the world. We're called to be salt and light, to be their witnesses, to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And so that's been such an encouragement, William, and it's so great to hear about all the ministry that you're doing there. And thank you. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Tim and Carys, and thank you all so much for joining. It's been great to have you with us. Please do keep William and his church in your prayers, and all the Scottish leaders in your prayers as we continue to challenge the church lockdown here. And please do pray for us, and we hope you are keeping well and joyful, delighting in God and his goodness and his promises. And we look forward to seeing you next time on Round the Table.